Now we've got to the point where we want to start iterating over our arrays. Now, so far we've learned quite a lot about JavaScript arrays and how to add or remove. And now we're going to learn how to iterate over array. Now, another term for iterate, a much simpler term, would be to loop over an array. So when we talk about iterating, we talk about looping, which means that we're going to cycle through each element one by one and perhaps do something to it or check whether a property exists and so forth. Now, in this video, we're going to focus on what we call an imperative array loop. And this is because we're going to imperatively instruct JavaScript of how to loop over this array using keywords such as for, which we have available. So from the top, let's go ahead and create a constant. Here I'm going to call this our drinks array. And simply inside, we're going to say we have Pepsi, we also have lemonade, and we also have cola. Now, what we want to do is jump down and we're going to introduce you, if you've not already seen this for keyword. Now, this allows us to create 1, 2, and 3 different kinds of statements which are then executed. Now, typically the first part of this for, and you may hear the terms such as a for loop. So this is where the for keyword comes into play. Now, the for loop has a following syntax. As we mentioned, we have 3 different types of statements. Now, in statement 1, we'll typically see something like this, where we would declare a variable. Now, this first piece of code, this first statement in our for loop, is executed before the rest of the code block inside of here is then executed. Now, after each iteration, we also get a final piece of code, which we'll come on to momentarily. What we want to do next is define a particular condition for when this code block should in fact keep iterating. Now, it's typical at this stage, we would do something like I is less than, and then we reference the length property on our array. So again, you can see that this is another statement and we're making use of that .length property, which we know quite well. Now, our final statement typically looks something like this, where we would then go ahead and increment this value. So we start off with a brand new variable with a value of 0, and we say that we want to continue the loop while our value of I, which will be 0, is less than drinks.length. So what happens is that we've actually got a length of 2 here, remember 0, 1, and 2, and then after each execution, we then increment this variable. So when this 0 is no longer less than our drinks length, we've essentially reached the end of the array. So at this point, we can go ahead and just have a look what's inside. So if we say we want to console log out our drinks, this will in fact give us the entire array, which we don't really want to use. Now, as we've looked in previous videos, we've done something like this, where we have an index, and it may be that we want the index of 0 or perhaps 2 to fetch us our cola. Now, because we're using an I to kind of track where we are in this array loop, we can in fact pass I in, because remember, it's just a value, it's just a number value. And from the beginning, we start it with 0, and for each iteration, we then simply increase it. So it will start off as 0, 1, and 2, and then we'll finish the loop. So let's go ahead and hit save, and you can see here that we have each string has been logged out. Now, in a typical scenario, it might be that we are wanting to detect this individual drink. So it's probably a good idea at this point to say that the individual drink in each iteration. So it's another thing to keep in mind is that this piece of code will get executed for every item in the array, which means this constant of drink will in fact change per cycle. As we've seen here, we have Pepsi, lemonade, and cola. So what we would typically do is break things out into a constant like we've done above, and we do something like if the drink happens to equal, for example, lemonade, then we want to go ahead and execute a piece of code. Now, we're not really dealing with any real-world examples in this particular lesson, But as we progress on to further courses in the JavaScript offering which we have, we'll be dealing with these in much more detail, but this is the ground level that we need to know. So for instance, here if we have our drink is lemonade, we could then write a message. So you can see here that we are now back to just a single console log. So we're iterating through each of these, detecting that individual one, and then logging something out. It might be that in your applications, you are updating variables elsewhere in your JavaScript program. Now, in the next video, we're going to take this example and we're going to learn about the break and the continue keywords in our JavaScript array loops.